Welcome, everyone. We're so pleased that you could join us today for this session. We are reminded that we have a speaker with us today, and Kris comes to us with such great background and experience as an attorney, as a librarian, and so we are really pleased to have him be part of this start of a webinar series on legal topics. Today, we're talking about drafting, enforcing, and managing operational policies. This is kind of a more specific topical follow-up to the session that we did just a couple of weeks ago. That was a more of an overview of legal topics. So with that, I just want to welcome everybody. Know that this session is being recorded, and we will post the recording later on for those of you who can't join us in person. Please do use the chat to ask questions. I'll be monitoring that as we go along. And with that, Kris, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and you may take over.
Thank you.
Just a second.
I'll post my screen here so everyone can see it and follow along with our presentation. But as Colette said, this is a topic that I worked on for many years in helping and advising school districts and applying some of what I've learned in those local government situations with working with our K-12 public schools around the state on their policies and some of the things that I've learned in working with libraries and working here in the library at Helena College, trying to blend all of those different experiences into some best practices, some tips, and some perspectives on how to draft, enforce, and then manage your policies within your library. They are an important operational document. They are an important aspect of your library's operations, and so it's important to stay focused on them and keep them in the front of everyone's mind, both on the board and within the staff of each library. Our goals today are just to provide the reassurance, once again, that you're on the right track, that your work in your library is benefiting your patrons, it's supporting your community, and the aspects of the different operations within the library, including policies, are there to support those missions and support that work. And so perhaps some reminders of different aspects of operational policies within a library, perhaps some new ideas, new perspectives that can help you enhance your current policies, and perhaps something that, again, just works as a reassurance that, yeah, we are on the right track and we are doing things in an appropriate way for our community. And so the first question we always like to start with is, what is the process for policy adoption? How are these policies put together? Where do they come from? And what is the legal basis for them? And depending on the type of library in which you may work, whether it be a free public library within Montana, or a library district, or within a school district, there is a statute authorizing the governing board of that particular library to adopt bylaws, rules, in essence, policies to govern that particular library. And so 22-1-309, the free libraries established throughout Montana, has that specific section as noted in bold and underlined. So long as those policies, those rules are not inconsistent with the law, then the library board has that authority to exercise control over the operations of the library in a way that reflects the community's expectations, the community's needs, the patrons' needs. And that phrase of not being inconsistent with the law is where we're going to focus a lot of our discussion this afternoon. 22-1-707, those districts, library districts around the state have similar provision. Adopt rules for the operation and administration of that library district. And then school districts, school boards of trustees have the authority, have the obligation to adopt those policies necessary for regulating the use and operation of the school libraries within the district. And so those are just the authorization that we like to start with, that the boards that govern the specific types of libraries around the state are there to exercise that authority in a manner consistent with the applicable laws of the state of the United States, any ordinances within that local municipality or county, and in the rules and expectations of the school district when applicable. So the purpose of a library policy, and sometimes this may seem a bit obvious, but we like to always start at the beginning. What are we trying to achieve with our library policies? And an effective library policy is going to achieve these five goals, these five objectives, and we're going to touch on these in more detail in a little bit. But it's to maintain continuity, consistency, stability within the library. That regardless of who's employed at the library, who's serving on the board, that you have that continuity, you have that consistency, and your operations are handled in a way that are consistent with the law, of course, but also in a way that are easily understood and easily relied upon by both patrons, staff, policymakers, taxpayers. People understand that the library is working in a certain way, and it's going to continue to work in that way, regardless of the personalities, regardless of the individuals who may be involved in the library's governance. That way, you have that consistency, that you have that continuity, and you rely upon the rules, the expectations, the policies of the library into the future, knowing that you're setting a course for that efficient operation. And that's the fourth one that you can see there, the fourth bullet point. Operating in an efficient manner is important. You don't have to recreate the governance structure for each new situation that emerges. You don't have to look at trying to re-examine an issue and create a new set of rules or a framework for a new set of governance each time that a new situation emerges. You have a policy that sets forth the expectations for the library, and the staff can apply that policy in a manner that's consistent with the board's directives, the community's expectations, as well as the specific circumstances of that situation. And that allows for efficiency. You make sure you have the rules or the policy in place that can be easily interpreted and applied, and the library is able to move on and stay focused on delivering library services to the citizens in the community. And so that's an important part of a policy, is creating that foundation of stability, that foundation of efficiency, and ensuring that the process is workable regardless of the circumstances. The board and staff relations are another part of that you're able to delineate what the role of the board is in a specific situation, what the role of the staff is in applying the policies that are adopted by the board. Clarifying those roles are important, so that the two sets of stakeholders understand their respective roles. That the board is there to set those policies, set the vision, adopt the budget, complete those personnel decisions, and set the goals for the library, the objectives for the library, and then the day-to-day operations rest with the staff, consistent with the policies and the strategic plan, the budget that have been adopted by the board. And so having those policies in place help ensure that mutual understanding and again, contribute to the efficient operations of the library. When you have a situation that might be controversial, or there might be some scrutiny related to the situation or the decision that's reached in handling the situation, then you're able to legitimize your board's actions through the policy. When you have a statute that says the board may adopt a policy on a particular topic that's not inconsistent with the law, and then that policy is interpreted and applied to a specific situation that emerges within the day-to-day operations of the library, and someone questions that decision, then the board is able to, and the library itself as an entity, and the broader local government partners are able to say, no, The law authorizes the board to adopt a policy. A policy was adopted, and the decision reached in accordance with that policy is not inconsistent with the law, and as a result, that's a legitimate board action. So you have that support, you have the policy there to support the staff and support the administration of the library in the completion of specific tasks and the completion of decision-making procedures related to a specific situation. And then by extension, you have a legal record stemming from that decision, stemming from that action, which is often going to be specifically called for in the law or the policy. And then you have the record that can be utilized to support the decision if there is any scrutiny or a challenge later. And as a result, that record furthers the legitimacy of the library's action. All of this is to reach these 5 goals, but also it helps provide a first line of defense in the event that there is litigation or a threat of litigation. All of these are achieved through an effective and appropriately written policy. It allows for any type of judge or other tribunal to review the decision, review the enforcement or interpretation of the policy, and then the the court would be able to say, yeah, the library was within its authority to adopt this policy. The policy was not inconsistent with the law. It was interpreted and applied in a consistent and equitable manner. It was not discriminatory in any way, and the decision that was reached by the staff or by the board was supported by law. And so that's a situation where you're never operating your library out of fear of litigation, and you operate the library in a way that's consistent with the law and the policy. And if there is litigation, then that appropriate operation will be your first line of defense. And that's the goal with having soundly written, up to date, and current policies within your library governance. The foundations of any library policy are typically going to be in the law, whether it be the Montana Code Annotated, the United States Code. There may be administrative rules of Montana or Code of Federal Regulations that can be the basis for a particular policy, or it may be a judicial opinion. There may be a decision from the Montana Supreme Court or the United States Supreme Court or the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals that can help guide the policy development on a particular topic. The United States Constitution and the Montana Constitution can also be the basis for a library policy. Sometimes library policies evolve from established library practice, where there is a practice that's been developed in the community because of the specific circumstances or the layout of the facility, the makeup of the staff, or the needs of the community. And that can all develop into an effective library policy that is not inconsistent with the law and is useful for the library staff when working with patrons on their specific information needs. And so having that practice codified into a policy is important to, again, achieve those 5 goals of having effective library policy in place. The other areas where you can see policies develop are recommendations from the local government partners, whether it be the city or the county, or it may be their insurance carrier or the library's insurance carrier that has perspectives on a particular best practice that can help make sure that the library has a policy that's consistent with the insurance policy or consistent with the practice of the local government, whether it be in matters of human resources or budgeting. Then you're able to have that policy written in place to support the library's operations and ensure consistency with other government partners or stakeholders. The board and the community may have particular perspectives, outlooks on the governance of the library based on the specific needs of the community, and that can also develop into a written library policy. Again, so long as it's not inconsistent with the law, so long as it's not discriminatory or engaging any type of financial malfeasance or any type of improper conduct or any conflict with perhaps the public records or open meeting laws. Those different types of areas could lead to inconsistency with the statutes or the laws of the United States or the state of Montana. And so if there is a philosophy or perspective that the library board thinks needs to be codified into a library policy, would first have to be confirmed to be consistent with the governing laws. But sometimes that does develop, and it can be the source of a library operational policy. I mentioned financial management briefly a few moments ago. Sometimes your auditor or the county treasurer or other financial um, advisor may have financial management practices that they advise that should be codified into a library operational policy. Again, confirming with the local governments that work with the library, it can help confirm that it is consistent with the financial practices of the local government from which the library derives its budget or develops its financial output. And so sometimes that's necessary to ensure compliance with auditing requirements, but those are the areas where you may see policies develop in order to help guide the operations of the library.
Kris, I think you might be touching on this as we go forward, so we can definitely kind of put this question a little bit later as you want to address it. But we're often asked, where is that bright line between policy and those operational sorts of things? For instance, human resources related things like job profiles. So that's kind of the question. What's the bright line, or is there a bright line between policies that are consistent with law and other sorts of kind of official documents that guide operation?
It's a good question, and the bright line that I think in developing a policy versus a procedure versus a handbook provision is always going to be based upon the level of detail necessary to guide the staff. A policy developed at a board level that is going to set the practice and the vision for the library on that particular topic is going to be written in a way that doesn't provide too great of detail in an attempt to um, anticipate or govern every small little detail. It provides that, it strikes that balance between providing the authorization to the staff to develop a decision-making process to implement and enforce the policy. And then that process of how the policy is interpreted and applied can be the procedure to support the policy. And we'll talk about the need for a library to have a policy on policies, which sounds like a pain in the neck, but it's a good first step in saying, yes, this is how our policies are developed. This is what a purpose of a policy is, and this is how they're drafted and adopted. And then we authorize the administration, the director, or the staff or designee to develop procedures and to support the interpretation of the policy. And those procedures don't necessarily rise to the level of being adopted by the board, but they're the interpretation and the applicability, the enforcement mechanism of that particular policy. And they could be confined in an operations manual, an operations handbook, employee handbook, all of that thing. And what that distinction then is the if you think about the tiers of laws in the state of Montana, where you have a constitution and you have the statutes and then you have the regulations and then you have each agency with its operations and procedures, that as you get further and further into a topic, you get more and more detail into a topic, but they all are within the confines of the Constitution and the statutes. They all are consistent. So it's a distillation of the policy into the handbook. It's a distillation of the policy into the procedure to ensure that it's understandable for the staff so that they can implement it. And so it's a good question. The bright line is one that you'll see when you know it. This policy is too unwieldy. This policy is now too detailed. This policy is now too complicated, and we've gone too far. And so, I think those bright lines might vary from topic to topic, and perhaps from library to library. But um, there is a way to set that tone by having a policy on policies that sets out what exactly will be contained in a policy, and then authorizing the staff or the administration and director of the library to take the next step in developing the details that are necessary to interpret and apply the policy.
Thanks. That's really helppful so that, the large to the small detail,
Yeah.
we have to kind of take that into consideration.
And we'll talk about it in various ways in the next few slides. But if there's any further need for more discussion on, we can capture it at the end as well. Some sources for policies. The state library is going to have its assistance on the policies. A source for those, the libraries, State Library Association, developing those samples that you'll also be able to see from other library leaders around the state. For school libraries, the School Board Association has developed those and has those available that can be revised and refined to meet specific school district needs. Your library's legal counsel or the other partners that you have within your local government will be able to assist in putting those policies together to make sure, again, that everything is consistent, that there's no internal conflict between a procedure and a policy, or an ordinance and a policy, or the law and the policy. You'll have that consistent source around each topic that serves as a foundation for that governance in an effective manner. So drafting that policy, putting the policy together, what are some of the tips on how to make sure that that policy achieves what you want? The first thing, whenever we're talking about policy or supporting documents for a policy, is to remember that they're public documents. And if it's a public document, you're using that document to communicate to the public. You're communicating to all stakeholders, whether they be non-patron taxpayers or citizens, patrons and regular patrons, no matter how frequent or infrequent they may be using the library, your other policymakers, government partners within the community, the policymakers at a statewide level, the employees of the library, and anyone who's interested in your library's operations, even if they don't live in the community or even in the state. How are you drafting a policy to communicate to each of these potential stakeholders? The first step is to develop a format for your policies that is consistent, that has either a numbering system or a codification system that allows for quick and easy access, that are organized by topic, that says, well, this policy starts with a 1. The 100s are general governance of the library. 200s relate to collection management. 300s are about meeting spaces. 400s are about community engagement. And you have those types of the substructure within the codification system to help people understand where they might be able to find a policy on a topic that they're interested about or interested in learning more about. And so you have that numbering system, codification system, and then each policy on its face will have the title, the subject. This policy is about meeting rooms, and this policy has subject headings that you would think about when you put together any cataloging for any book. That these headings are there to say this is about meeting spaces, this is about public events, and you have that policy all listed in there. People are able to identify within the body of the policy the specific areas that they might want to zero in on or learn more about by having those headings. An objective statement at the top of each policy will be important. It'll state in clearer language what the purpose of this policy is attending to achieve, and how it's achieving it through the particular provisions under each of those subject headings. And then an adopted on date, revised on date. When was this policy adopted? It was adopted in 1999 and it was revised in 2019. You're able to keep track of that so that people can see the evolution of the policy if they were to go and revisit those board meeting minutes. And the minutes are the documents associated with the governance of the particular library. And by looking at that policy revised on date and adopted on date, they can go back and look at those minutes and see the development of the policy and why it was changed or when it was changed. Going back to the objective of the policy, making sure it's easily understood and setting the tone for any reader of the policy, any person that you're attempting to communicate with on this particular topic. That this policy about meeting rooms is here to develop a process for the staff of the library to engage with the community on the reservation and utilization of the library's meeting rooms. And that's a simple statement that just says this is what we're trying to do with this policy. And then you have the specific um, headings about different types of meeting rooms, different types of meetings, different types of events, and putting that all together in a way that's logical, in a way that people can understand, without getting too unwieldy in terms of the language used or the 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 length of the policy, and making it easy for people to access and grasp. And having that all put together in a way that is consistent with the law is important. We know that that's an obligation of any library board, is that the library policy has to be consistent with the law. So if you have statutes that relate to a particular topic, and you can use that language as much as possible to set out how the policy is going to work, or if there's a court decision that says what it's going to be, and then including the legal references if necessary at the bottom of the policy with the revised on date can be helpful to support and again legitimize the library's actions through the development and adoption of the policy. Always using clear, plain language that's easily understood, short sentences that get the point across. Too many commas or semicolons can be difficult for any person to read and follow. Using bullet points or numbering that allows for someone to easily access and understand the language that's being used in the policy is important. And as I touched on a few moments ago, don't try to address every possible issue within a governance or operational policy. You're setting a framework with the policy and craft language that will sufficiently address the topic consistent with the objective of the policy. It shouldn't be too general that it's not enforceable or that it's obvious or that's too vague. And that can be difficult to defend in court if you have something that's too ambiguous. But if you're able to develop and strike that balance between being sufficiently specific without being overly general, then you're in a situation where you have established the framework consistent with the intent or the objective of the policy. Break the issue down into subtopics, subheadings, making sure that you have 3 or 4 sentences, a few paragraphs on that particular subtopic within the larger policy area. And if you break it down, then you're able to supply the public with the necessary information on how this issue will be handled. And then authorize the director to develop those procedures, to develop those methods of interpreting and enforcing the policy consistent with the intent of the policy as adopted by the board and the mission of the library through the strategic plan. And then once that policy is put together, you're in a situation where it can be referred to the full board for review and adoption or consideration and adoption. Having that kind of process in place is important. And some libraries may have a committee of staff that work on policies. You may have a committee of the board that works on policies or a joint staff board committee. But whatever the case is, that should be the goal. You're not going to anticipate every possible issue. But if you develop language that is specific enough to address the objective without being too general that it can't be effectively interpreted and applied, then you're striking that balance to create an effective library policy to govern that particular topic. And then the adoption process, consistent with the statutes that we mentioned, once it's referred from the committee or the staff to the board, then you have a situation where you will follow your policy on policies to determine how a policy is reviewed, revised, adopted, terminated, or deleted. You may also have that provision within your library's bylaws or memorandum of agreement with the other government partners that provide detail on how certain policies or topics within the policy manual are adopted and considered. So if there is going to be a policy that is adopted or amended, revised, then it's important to post that on the agenda and have that discussion consistent with the open meeting laws. As you've heard in previous webinars, we will revisit in the future. The open meeting law is the first and best way to communicate with the public. And if they feel that they are involved in a decision-making process consistent with their rights under the Constitution, then they'll have and develop trust with the library. And so making sure that those committee meetings, the full board meetings, and the discussion of any change in policy or practice are all completed in accordance with the open meeting laws. And by extension, then the public has a chance to observe the meeting under their constitutional rights, but also participate in the meeting, comment on that particular policy prior to its final adoption. And that comment then is a chance to hear from the public about what they're thinking on this particular issue and topic and how the policy may need to be revised based on those perspectives. But once they're adopted, the policy has to be accessible, and not just accessible in terms of here's how you can find it, but accessible to people who may have site limitations, accessible to those who may have other differences in their abilities that require a version of the policy that can be read and understood regardless of that difference in ability. And so making sure that you have them posted on a website that's accessible to screen readers, making sure that they're physically available at the library and can be utilized and read or reviewed by any person who's visiting the library. Having that all anticipated and handled is the best way to make sure that they're truly accessible to anyone, any potential patron who may be interested in a particular topic. And then perhaps most importantly, they're not just adopted and placed in a binder and then that's where they exist for the next 20 years. They are reviewed consistent with the library standards in the state of Montana that review those regularly. They're always reviewed after a legislative session. They're reviewed after library commission meetings. If there's a topic that affects a particular policy, they're reviewed. If there's a judicial decision that has affected a particular aspect of the library's operations, they're reviewed. If there's a change in practice or there's a different guidance from the county or the different guidance from the city, they are a living document. And if the staff reports to the board that an aspect of the policy isn't working, or there's an issue, a gap in the policy that needs to be addressed, all of that would require frequent revisiting of those policies so that they are up to date and that they are consistent not only with the law, but with the practices of the library. An easy way to run into trouble is and face threats of litigation is if there is a practice, something happening in the library that is not consistent with the policy. If the practice changed and the policy didn't, that can be problematic. And then if there is an employee handbook or if there is a collective bargaining agreement for employees within the library, then the policies would need to be consistent with those provisions and not to be in conflict. The handbook would be a distillation of the policy, as I said. There should never be a situation where there's a question of what governs the policy or the handbook. They should be consistent with one another. And the best way to do that is through frequent revisiting of those documents. And if one changes, there may need to be a change in the other. And if there's a change in the bargaining agreement that affects a policy, then it's important for that discussion to occur with the respective bargaining unit. And so that's the adoption. And when you have that adoption in place and you have a policy in place, then frequent revisiting of it will help make sure that the policies remain an active living document that helps and supports the staff in making sure that the library runs efficiently.
Kris, there's a question along the
Sure.
lines of accessibility. Should policies be translated into other languages?
It's a it's a question that comes up frequently, and there should be a method uh, to to have that translation occur. There's some translation uh, platforms that are available online that can get the policy or any kind of government document into a workable format of that particular language. The problem with those platforms is that in our communities around Montana that are on or adjacent to tribal lands, those translation platforms don't include those particular languages that we would have in those communities, or that some of the citizens in those communities may be relying upon. And so, working with schools or elders in those areas to develop translated versions of the policies may be a good idea, so that if someone does need a version of the policy in that language, that they can access it. But utilizing Google Translate or other low-cost platforms can be an effective tool if someone does visit the library and says, I need assistance in this area." It can help avoid confusion. It can help avoid problems in applying the policy, but most importantly, it's just being a good neighbor when someone needs that assistance in their language of origin. Some areas that many of you probably have topics policies on in these topic areas, but it may be one that jumps out at you that is thinking, well, we don't have one on that, but um, just taking a look at that list, checking how do we have a policy that covers these issues? Do we have a do we have guidance from our government partners on these topics? Is this something that we have talked about recently? Is this something that we haven't talked about recently, and we have a policy from the 90s that we need to take another look at? And so, just a list. It's not exhaustive by any stretch, but just a list to keep in mind that you could take a look at it and just confirm that your policies have been updated recently on these topics, and that the policy, most importantly, reflects the specific practice that's ongoing in the library on these areas. So one of the aspects of the presentation that we talked about is managing policies, interpreting policies. What should we be doing in these areas? And if we do it correctly, what are the benefits of enforcement of particular policies? And when I say enforcement, I'm meaning consistent enforcement. No one gets a special deal because um, of who they are in the community, or they don't get a special waiver of the policy, or there's no exception to the policy. We're not suspending the policy for someone because we know who they are, or they used to be on the library board. Consistent application of the policy of any policy is important to avoid claims of impropriety, to avoid claims of discrimination or unfairness. And when you have that in place, then that consistency in place, then you're able to protect yourself against claims that something has been done in a manner inconsistent with the law because of a variety of reasons, whether it be discrimination on the basis of religion, or whether it be just run-of-the-mill unfair treatment, that you didn't treat me equally under the policy. And so consistent enforcement is important. So we revisit those 5 factors, those 5 purposes of a policy, and we derive benefits from them in these next few slides. One of those was creating a legal record. If the purpose of a policy is to create a legal record, then an effective policy is going to show that the library followed its own policy, follow it consistently as it has in every situation that's come up. And one example of a policy where that is necessary is your complaint policy, your grievance policy, or your reconsideration policy. If you have that policy in place and you're then following it consistently, regardless of the type of material that's been as request for reconsidered or the type of grievance or complaint that has come in from a citizen or a patron, then you're deriving the benefit of getting that legal record, of meeting the purpose of the policy, which is to say, we have followed the policy, we have developed it, we have written the policy consistent with the applicable laws and the federal case law on this topic, and we have followed it in a way that the director has interpreted the policy, met with the complainant, met with the person conducting or requesting the reconsideration, following that process that's outlined in the reconsideration or complaint policy step by step, completing the correspondence, completing the notes, completing the record, and then ultimately, if there has been an appeal or the need for a board meeting, then there is a decision by the board that's documented in the meeting minutes, confirmed in correspondence back to the complainant. And we have developed a record and a file on this topic that is required by the policy, but also supports our staff and supports our library's operations because we have carefully managed this situation as required by the law. And so that's a situation where you're deriving the benefit that's consistent with the purpose. One of the purposes of policy is create a legal record. We derive a benefit by making sure we follow the policy. We have a clearly written policy that's updated, it's consistently applied, and we build that file, we build that record based on that, the details and the contents of that policy. Another situation where you might have a purpose of a policy is to support efficient operations. And when trying to achieve efficient operations, that you're able to establish in the policy specific, methodical, consistent processes to handle routine matters. So the staff doesn't have to recreate it every time. An example of a policy that's supporting efficiency is volunteer policy. How do we handle volunteers? We know that we have to check with our insurance carrier on workers' compensation and liability insurance. We have to make sure that we have background checks or review certain volunteers depending on their access to information and access to patrons. We know we have to have a volunteer agreement form that they sign to abide by all district, not all district, library district, but all library policies. And when we have those papers in place, then we're able to routinely handle those individuals who want to serve the library as volunteers. By having that in place and having a policy that establishes those practices, then we're deriving that efficiency because we don't have to handle each one specially, or we don't have to create a new process for each requested volunteer. Instead, we have an established practice, established policy, forms to accompany those requests. We turn those forms into the volunteer, the prospective volunteer completes them, returns them, and then they're able to be onboarded as a volunteer consistent with that policy. You're making sure that you have an established practice that handles the issue efficiently, does not create new work each time someone wants to volunteer, and the staff that supervises or works with those volunteers is able to manage them efficiently. The library derives the benefit of the volunteer services. The patrons have the benefit of their services, and the library remains a safe and a suitable setting that's enhanced because of the volunteer services and the efficient manner in which the volunteers are onboarded. So when you're looking at developing a policy that achieves efficient operations, as an example of how you can do so by establishing specific, methodical, and consistent practices is written into the policy and the supporting forms. We talked about the board staff relations being clarified and enhanced through the development of a policy and development of policies that outline those specific and respective roles. If you have an effective policy on this topic, then it's going to show that division of labor. It's going to implement and codify and institutionalize the division of labor and show how the board works with the staff and the staff works with the board to mutually benefit the community through an effective governance structure for the library. And one example where that happens frequently is the policy on policies. The policy on governance or the operational policies within the library is going to be written consistent with the applicable statute that I discussed in Title 22 or in area of a school board in Title 20 of Montana Code Annotated. Then you're going to refine that based on the bylaws of the library, based on the memoranda, the agreements with the government partners in the area. And that policy on policies will then set forth how policies are developed, that the role of the library board under the bylaws and under the law is to set forth the vision and the tone and the governance structure of the library, and then that's implemented day-to-day basis by the director and the staff. And you have a policy that sets that out and explains it and how these two entities are unified and work together. And by having it written in a policy, then it helps avoid confusion when you have new board members or new staff. Well, this is our respective roles. This is how we work together. We have these there's a unified governance team to help make sure that the goals of the library and the objectives of the library are completed. This policy helps set that forth for everyone, including our patrons, to understand. You have that policy on policies set out that the board in its policy committee works with the staff on reviewing policies, revising policies, developing suggested changes, forwarding them to the full board for that discussion in an open meeting where public comment is reviewed, and then the process for developing procedures or distillation of the policy in order to make sure it's enforced in a consistent manner and enforced in a way that's compliant with the board's intent, as well as the respective laws of the state of Montana or the United States that may apply. When that's all put into a policy and all put into a governance document, then it helps avoid confusion. And it models the positive, transparent conduct that we all want out of our government. And as librarians, we are in a particular interest in having transparent, accessible information. And so modeling that behavior for other policymakers and government officials to see is important. And it shows that we're serious about our respective profession and mission in having that positive behavior put into a policy that shows a unified governance structure, shows a unified approach to efficient library operations is important. And so a policy can yield an important benefit in achieving the purpose of clarified board staff relations. Another benefit that we talked about, the purpose that we talked about for a library policy is continuity, consistency, and stability. How do we make sure that we have a stable setting in our library governance, and how do we ensure continuity if there's change in the board or change in the staff, and how do we consistently apply policies compliant with the law in a way that people can understand and they can kind of anticipate or predict how a situation will be resolved based on the policy. If you have an effective operational policy that's achieving this purpose, then you're going to yield certain benefits that we've mentioned throughout. But one example of that policy that's ensuring continuity and stability, consistency is your meeting rooms policy. And we talked about in the last webinar about the First Amendment rights of citizens regarding government buildings, public forum, designated public forum, limited public forum, and traditional public forum. This is where the meeting room policy comes into play, and having that set out in a policy can make sure that you're consistent with the case law on the issue, consistent with the Constitution, constitutional interpretations on the issue, and then you refine it based on the layout of your library, based on the facility that you have, and based on the number of meeting rooms or the types of meeting rooms. and then putting that all into a policy that says this is how the staff is going to handle reservations. This is a platform you use to make a reservation. This is how the staff can work with you on organizing technology, or this is what the staff can and can't do on the facilitation of the meeting. And you put all that into a policy, then it's there and it's compliant with the law. It gives guidance to the staff on how to work with the entities who are reserving a room, or the groups or the individuals who are reserving a room. And then you're able to yield the benefit of that continuity and stability because you have a comprehensive policy that provides the necessary detail in an easily understood manner that the potential room reservers or the patrons and community members can understand. And if then authorizing the director to develop the procedures to implement it and develop a platform for meeting room reservations can all be embedded in the policy, and you yield that benefit of continuity, consistency, and stability because you have achieved the objective of the policy, which is to inform, communicate, and set forth a workable framework on that topic. And then legitimizing library operations. You're going to uh, achieve the objective of supporting the staff when they make decisions in real time on sensitive topics, or any topic for that matter. And that real-time decision-making process that the director or their designee or the staff person who's in charge of the library at that particular hour follows the policy, and their decision is legitimized. Their decision is supported by the policy the board has adopted. And so managing those day-to-day operations and making decisions in real time can yield benefits of the staff being supported, the decision being legitimized, and the record being developed, and that the efficient operation occurs. And so this legitimization of a decision and the actions of library staff can yield all of those benefits. And one area where that routinely can come up is patron conduct. And having a patron conduct policy that understands the First Amendment, as we talked about last time, in the rights to access information, the operations of the library in a safe and appropriate manner without undue interference on that right to access information, can all be put into a policy that then authorizes the staff to make decisions about when a patron has violated the policy and the consequences for violating that policy. And then if someone were to say, the staff abused my rights, or the staff violated my rights, and when I was deemed to have violated the policy, the board on a complaint or an appeal of a library staff decision can say, no, you are a patron of the library, and we have a code of conduct that's consistent with the law, that's consistent with the expectations of library operations in the professional standards that we've set in Montana and around the United States. And you've violated that, and you've interfered with the ability of the staff to complete their jobs. You've interfered with the rights of other patrons to access information. And so the decision of the staff member in this case was appropriate. And that would be the hypothetical statement of the library board in response to that type of grievance or complaint. Say, no, the staff handled this correctly, and your complaint is denied. And so by having a policy that's written carefully, that follows those guidelines for drafting and developing and adopting a policy, you legitimize and support the staff in their decision-making process when they have to make a decision in real time, without the benefit of hindsight, or without the benefit of perhaps the board being there to help with the decision, or the benefit of the law enforcement, or without the benefit of even legal counsel. They know that the policy supports them, and if they follow the policy, their actions and their decisions will be legitimized. And so that's our goal. And if you work to that objective, you can yield the benefit accordingly. So that's a lot of information. We'll summarize just a reminder that the helpline is available through the Montana Library Association, helpline at mtlib.org, and the inquiries that come in through that email address will come to me, and then we'll be able to discuss any questions that you might have about these or any other topics, and we'll either be able to respond with necessary information or point you to the appropriate place to get the information and the assistance that you need. And so we have a few minutes, I think. Are there any questions that we want to talk about, or any additional thoughts, topics that I missed or may have confused or created a need for further discussion on this topic?
I don't have any specific questions from the chat, but I do want to encourage if anyone wants to unmute or add their question in the chat while we have just a couple of minutes left in our time together. We'd be happy to address those. While we're waiting for that information to come in, I did share the upcoming dates for the next topical webinars, and can't wait to tackle this next item, which is patron behavior and safety policies. Kris, you've done a great job of kind of teeing up the next logical topic and idea with this last example. And so let's see here, just monitoring. The recording from today's session will be posted to the Aspen event and our YouTube channel a little bit later today. So thanks for passing on those links and sharing those with fellow board members or other librarians who couldn't join us today.
Yeah, and as you work on policies, I see several libraries are working on updating their policies or revisiting them. If you have questions, you can send it to the helpline, and we'll be ready to look at your drafts or make suggestions. Or if you have an area of a sticking point or a sentence that doesn't quite work, we're always ready to assist and be ready to collaborate with the state library staff on finding the best way to get that to work for your community. So no question is too small or too big. We're always ready to try to help get your work done.
That is awesome. Thank you so much for spending time with us, everybody, today. And we look forward to seeing you next time when we tackle our next topic and get to hear from Kris with his great experience and just really wise and clear words about being consistent and being practical. The policies that we set are the kind of and the language that we use help set everybody up for success in accessing the library, its resources, and making sure that staff in particular are supported in the interactions that they have day to day with their patrons and with the information that they have to present. So thank you so much again, Kris, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.